files. Before we get started, I'll give you a quick introduction about myself. I've been at Bishop Fox since early 2023 when I joined as part of the SkillBridge program. I joined SkillBridge to transition from military service to the civilian workforce. During my time in the Air Force, I served as a senior operator and technical lead of a DoD Red Team. I have a Bachelor of Science in Cybersecurity from University of Maryland Global Campus. I've developed several open source tools in addition to SwaggerJacker, including a couple of tools called Fave and Dirty Words. And I'm also credited with publishing numerous CVEs. We're excited to have you here with us today for this training session on SwaggerJacker to show you how you can improve auditing of OpenAPI definition files during your application penetration tests. If you'd like to chat and hang out after the live stream, meet me in the Hackers Lounge on the Bishop Fox RedSec Discord server. Just a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll first go over kind of what Swagger is in relation to APIs. We'll go into the OpenAPI specification and how that relates to the Swagger project. We'll talk about some common flaws that you might encounter with the API routes that are defined in these specification files. And we'll go on to SwaggerJacker itself, how you can use that tool, what its intended purposes are, and roll right into a live demo. So you might be asking, what is Swagger? When we talk about Swagger in terms of APIs, we're really talking about the Swagger project, which is a suite of tools developed by SmartBear Software. In 2010, SmartBear Software released the Swagger specification, and it was really just a simple specification to assist with the development of RESTful APIs. This kind of provided a common blueprint for developers to work with and allowed them to document the APIs in a way that would be easily digestible by others. Later, the Swagger UI was added to the project. This is sort of a playground for testing the APIs, testing interactions, and it was based on the associated definition file. Swagger Editor, you can see on the right-hand side, it has that UI integrated, and then on the left-hand side, it has a text editor. So it just makes it easy to edit the specification on the fly and see the changes in the UI in real time. And then the Swagger Code Gen really just simplifies the build process by generating client SDKs. You can see it supports languages like C#, Go, Java, PHP, Python, several other languages. It also allows you to generate server stubs and API documentation. So one of the points of confusion when discussing this topic is often, I guess, the differences between OpenAPI and Swagger. I know when I was researching this myself, I got a little confused what was different between the two. Then I started digging into the history of the Swagger project, and that kind of opened my eyes. So you can see here, Swagger project started in 2010 with that Swagger specification, and the Swagger project is still ongoing to this day. The main difference is in 2015, the Swagger specification was donated to the Linux Foundation, and they later renamed that specification to the OpenAPI specification. So the OpenAPI specification is what's still in development to this day. Swagger specification is no longer the namesake, but as far as tools like Swagger UI, Swagger Editor, Swagger Code Gen, those still exist under the Swagger project and keep the Swagger name. So you might be asking what changed with the migration to the OpenAPI specification. Like I said, it was donated to the Linux Foundation in 2015. It was renamed in 2016, and then a year later, that was the first major version change. So in July of 2017, they released version 3, and this overall just introduced a more simplified structure for the specification. It added changes to the various security flows, added things like OpenID Connect discovery support. It added better parameter descriptions, so things like cookies are supported in parameters now, whereas opposed to the previous specification, you had to supply cookies through like custom header values, so it wasn't really supported. And then version 3.1 was released in February of 2021. This made the paths object optional, and then it also made the latest JSON schema is fully compatible with that. So any language that's supported in the JSON schema, you can use that same language with the updated Swagger UI, or sorry, the updated OpenAPI specification. And there were also several other changes, but we're not going to get into all the changes today. Just really providing you a brief overview of what has changed since the migration from Swagger project. So some of the common flaws that you might encounter on these API routes when you find a exposed definition file. I first want to note that just because you see a Swagger UI or a OpenAPI definition file, that doesn't necessarily mean it's an issue on its own. Sometimes developers put these out there publicly for legitimate reasons. They might have a API that they want the public to interact with, so they put this out there to facilitate those interactions. So just keep in mind, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you see one of these out there. When it, I guess, gets more interesting is if you start seeing language based around like internal API routes or administrative endpoints, things of that nature might be a little bit more interesting to look at. Usually when developers create APIs for internal use, they may have not necessarily put as much effort into security for those APIs. So that could introduce vulnerabilities like access control issues. You could request some of these endpoints and gain access to sensitive information. You might find IDOR flaws, SQL injection vulnerabilities. File uploads is another big one. So you might see an API route that allows you to upload a file. These are always good to test for being able to upload like stored XSS payloads or upload files that give you remote code execution. And then really any other vulnerability type that you'd see on a typical web application, it's good to test on these as well. So how do we test these with SwaggerJacker? Well, SwaggerJacker has three main commands. The automate command is used to just send requests to the server based on the endpoints that are defined within the document. So it'll send the requests and analyze that response code that comes back. If it sees like a 200 OK, that's a good indicator that the endpoint's accessible. If it sees like a 401 or 403 response, that's probably a indicator that you don't have access without like an API key or something of that nature. And then it might also return like 404s and give you specific feedback that says like order information isn't found based on the value that was provided. So those are always good to investigate further manually after using the automate command. And that brings us into the prepare command. So this generates curl commands that you can copy and paste and modify as you need, specifically for manual testing. So this is good to use after the automate command just to kind of narrow down the endpoints that you can access or endpoints that might look interesting, and then test manually from there. And then finally, the endpoints command returns a list of defined routes. It does not replace placeholder values such as like curly brace, pet ID, in curly brace. So those will still be output in the routes. If you want to change those, you can use other tools like sed. But as of this time, it does not replace those placeholder values. But overall, the endpoints command is more so intended just to generate word lists for use for either like directory brute forcing or fuzzing, things of that nature. And that was just a high-level overview. We'll jump into a live demo. So we'll start out looking at the Swagger UI. You can see here it's broken down into categories of different endpoints that are defined in the specification. So we have the pet category, which is everything about pets. We have the store category. All of these endpoints provide access to pet store orders. Then we have the user category, which has operations about the user. And then you can look at these each of these individual endpoints. You'll see the method that is accepted by the API. You also see a description. So for this one, it says get user by username. And then if you expand this, you can see the different parameters that are accepted. So you can see that it expects the username parameter, and this is required. And this is of type string. So if we try it out, it says the name that needs to be fetched, use user1 for testing. So we can type user1 here and click execute, and it'll provide a example piece of data for that user1 user. Now these aren't always going to show that you need to use like a specific user. Most cases it won't show that data, but since this is a demo, it gives you test data that you can use. But if you didn't know that data, say you go in and enter test and click execute, you can see it says user not found. So this is just a brief overview of how you can test these APIs through the Swagger UI. But we're not really here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Swagger Jacker. So we'll go in and grab this URL for the definition file. And before we start, we can click this link to actually view the definition file in the browser. You can see it has all of the routes defined. It has descriptions for each path, all of the parameters that are expected. And you can really just get a better understanding of the API itself, kind of get more information that you wouldn't see at surface level through things such as the UI. But we'll go ahead and open command line and go ahead and run the help command for Swagger Jacker. So you can see here a bunch of different flags are available to you. 3 different arguments. You can use automate, endpoints, and prepare, as I said earlier. We'll go ahead and start out with the automate command. If you don't really want to send a bunch of requests to the target right off the bat, I'd recommend starting with the prepare command. It'll generate less traffic and allow you to test manually without sending all of those requests. But for testing purposes, we'll just go ahead and use automate. We'll provide it the TACU flag to provide it a definition file from a URL. Go ahead and paste that definition file in from earlier. And then just some of the other arguments that can be provided, or some of the flags that can be provided. So you can give it a base path, which you see over here in the specification file. These are often defined in the base path object, or in the case of the OpenAPI specification, they might be defined in, I believe it's the server object. In this case, it's already defined, but you may need to provide that manually if you run into some errors with a different definition file. You can supply formats, so JSON, YAML, JavaScript, if it's not already provided. In our case, it's already given through the file extension, so we don't need to provide that. You can supply custom headers. You can skip certificate validation checks for SSL sites. You can also load definition files through local files. So if you don't want to fetch it from a URL, you can save it locally and load it from there. You can run it through a proxy such as Burp if you want to do some manual testing through there, or run it through any other proxy. You can run the quiet flag if you don't want to be prompted for certain conditions, which we'll see what that looks like here in a bit. You can also provide custom targets. So if you find a definition file that's hosted on one URL and the definition file states explicitly that the APIs are running on a different host, then you can supply that custom target and it'll send the request to the host that the API is on rather than the host that the definition file is hosted on. Hopefully that makes sense. I know it's a lot of words. It's hard to explain, but sometimes you'll need to send requests to a different host than what the definition file is actually hosted on. You can set the timeout period, so you can either extend it or shorten it or make it whatever timeout period you want. And then finally the URL, which we already provided through that TACU flag. We'll go ahead and run it and see what happens. So you can see right off the bat, we were prompted for an API key. Normally, if you're testing one of these things out in the wild, you probably won't have an API key to provide here. But if you do find one, or if you find one in the description like we have here, you can definitely supply that. So you can see here it says use the API key special key to test authorization filters. We'll go ahead and type yes and supply that value. And you see it already gets 2 hits on accessible endpoints, but then it prompts us again for a dangerous keyword that was found. So Swaggerjacker has a built-in list of bad words, essentially things that might perform dangerous actions if we're not careful with them. So have checks built in just to make sure you want to test those endpoints. In this case, we found an order endpoint. It is a demo site, so we're not too concerned with anything malicious happening. We'll go ahead and type yes. You see that some requests were found to be accessible. Other endpoints, it says order not found, so we supplied the value test. There's probably not an order name test, so that explains why the order wasn't found. Seeing that the order wasn't found, it's definitely good to go in and test that with more likely values, such as like order numbers, like 1, 2, 3, iterated all the way up to whatever normal values would be. Pet not found, same thing for that. Pets might have like numerical IDs that you could test, or names like Fido. So it'd be good to test that endpoint for actual values. And then it says we found another dangerous keyword. We'll go ahead and type no this time to avoid testing that one. And then it asks if we want to avoid all dangerous requests. We'll go ahead and say yes. And you can see it skipped all of those dangerous requests after we said we want to avoid them all. So we got a bunch of accessible endpoints back. We might want to test these manually. So to do this, we can replace the automate argument with prepare. And go ahead and run that. Prompted for API key again. We'll go ahead and type no this time since we're just generating commands. And you can see it generated a big list of curl commands that we can use to test the API manually. We'll go ahead and try this first one. Paste it in here. And you can see it says user not found since we supplied that value test. If you remember earlier, I said we can provide user 1 and that returns actual data, but it didn't say anything about other users. With that numerical value, we can test for IDOR flaws. So go ahead and supply user 2, and it looks like other users are accessible as well. So this is how you could test for IDOR flaws in real life, just by going in, finding an actual user, and then iterating IDs manually. Oftentimes usernames or endpoints that retrieve users won't always be the username. Sometimes they'll be like these user IDs. So you could, in the same manner, iterate those user IDs to also detect potential IDORs. And then you can test for other flaws through these curl commands too, like SQL injection. You could go in and test like %27, see if it errors out. It doesn't look like any other data was returned, or any unexpected data was returned. No verbose error messages or anything, so likely not vulnerable to SQL injection, which we don't expect it would be since this is a demo site. But just some things to test if you're using this in real life. And then finally we can get into the endpoints command. So replace the prepare argument with the word endpoints. And we'll go ahead and supply the quiet flag just to avoid prompting. Hit enter, and you can see it generates a word list. The placeholder values will be kept in for this endpoint command. So you can see like things like pet ID, order ID, username. Those will be all left in the paths if those placeholder values are defined in the specification. Obviously you can use things like sed to replace those with other values if you want to test different things. You can also output this to a file, so like words.txt, and then you can print the contents of that file just to make sure it's there. It is. So yeah, you could pass these word lists to other tools, use these endpoints for like forced browsing. You can use them for a number of things. So it's just good to have these build custom word lists, use them for fuzzing, use them for whatever you may need. And with that, that's basically it. A short and sweet demo, but I figured I'd show you guys how to use the tool. That concludes the training session. Thank you for joining us today. To learn more about Swaggerjacker and other Bishop Fox tools, be sure to check out our blog post and tools page on bishopfox.com. And we'd love to know what you think about this training session. So let us know in the chat. Join me in the Hackers Lounge on Bishop Fox Discord server. And if you want to talk more about Swaggerjacker, I'll be sure to answer any questions you have. Thanks, and see you next time.